Hey everyone, this is a review of Paul Sweezy and Bettelheim's The Transition to Socialism, published with Monthly Review Press in 1972. The review is by Paul Mattick Jr., the man. Alright, let's rock. In this collection of essays, Sweezy and Bettelheim are distinguished in style. Sweezy writing journalistically, with much quotation from newspaper writers and reference to real events, Bettelheim staying resolutely on an abstract plane, his, quote, scientifico-philosophical, end quote, approach to the, quote, depths beneath the, quote, surface, emphasized by his, quote, use of inverted commas. Nonetheless, they find themselves, at the conclusion of their theoretical labors, sharing roughly the same position. This position is, in brief, the following. Socialism means the power of the proletariat, the working class, over the social decision-making. The working class, however, molded by capitalist society, is incapable of developing concepts and forms of organization, permitting the working class to take and hold this power. This problem is intensified in the case of the underdeveloped countries, where anti-capitalist revolutions have actually taken place, by the numerical weakness of the proletariat. Therefore, a party of professional revolutionaries is needed, which distills from the workers' struggles, via its own scientific resources, a, quote, proletarian ideology, end quote. Concentrating in itself, as it were, the essence of the proletariat, the party must infuse the workers and the rest of the, quote, people with this ideology, so that they back the seizure of state power to institute socialism. So far, this is just good old Leninism, the ideological background to the hymn of praise to the Soviet state, with which Sweezy's first essay here, titled Lessons of Soviet Experience, begins. But the evolution of Russian society in the post-Stalin period has apparently raised new questions. There has arisen a gulf between the party as a ruling stratum and the workers. The principle of central economic planning seems to be giving way to a return to market relations. How is this, quote, return to the capitalist road, end quote, to be explained? Answer. Just as the party can have a proletarian practice, so the party can have a bourgeois practice, as the party can lead the workers to a realization of, quote, their own, end quote, aims, so it can lead these eternal followers to the restoration of bourgeois power. The key factor is the behavior of the party vis-a-vis the masses. Whether it remains in contact with the masses, developing the masses' ideas, and organizing means to put them into practice, or whether instead it imposes on them aims derived from the shadowy, quote, bourgeois forces, which remain after the revolution. Both possibilities exist, and degeneration is not necessary. If the Russian experience exemplifies the second, the first is gloriously illustrated by China's reaffirmation of the socialist road in the great proletarian cultural revolution. We will go over this position in some detail, but after 50 years of theoretical and practical, quote, Marxism-Leninism, this approach to the question of the, quote, transition to socialism should be of interest only to those who dream of representing the workers in the construction of a party which will seize power in their name. It remains a topic of talk for would-be revolutionists only because of the absence of a real workers' movement, which would leave us less time and energy for wandering in the byways of ideology. It is of no interest to the workers, whose current job actions and wildcats may be laying the basis for such a movement in the future. We can be sure it is of no interest to Chou En-lai when he discusses with Kissinger the future of Vietnam and Chinese-American trade. The workers and the rulers of whatever country must deal with realities. They know that in China, as in Russia, as in America, the working population does not decide on economic or foreign political policy. The workers try to get by with as good a life as possible, while their bosses strive to extract from them as much surplus labor as possible for their own purposes of accumulation and competition. Footnote. This is not to say that China, Russia, Cuba, etc., on the one hand, and the USA, etc., on the other, do not represent different types of society. In fact, I believe that Sweezy is in error in his belief that, quote, Libermanism is transforming Russia into a private capitalist system. While there is reason to think that Czechoslovakia is headed towards possible incorporation into the world market, the quote profit principle in Russia functions as a technique for the fulfillment of the plan. Party state run societies and private capitalism follow different quote laws of motion. They are alike in that both are class societies in which a few exploit the many. End footnote. But perhaps for us, who after decades without a real labor movement were forced to work out anew accurate concepts of capitalism and communism, it may be useful to descend into that particular place in the kingdom of dreams called Marxism, Leninism, Maoism. These three isms make strange bedfellows indeed. As Sweezy points out, Marx conceived of the communist movement, his theory, meant to serve as the work of proletarians in reaction to the conditions of developed industrial capitalism, while Lenin and Mao came to power in backward areas on the crest of largely peasant revolutions. A solution to the problem posed here, not for Marxist theory but for Bolshevik ideology, is suggested by Sweezy in his curious concept of the substitute proletariat. The substitute proletariat, essentially accepted by Bettelheim. The peasantry and petty bourgeoisie, for example, can function as a proletariat if they have served as a solidary, self-sacrificing revolutionary force, united with the proletariat under the guidance of the party, which represents the proletariat proper. Of course, from the Leninist point of view, as we shall see, the working class only really becomes, quote, proletarian when it is led by the proper party. But then it is only a small step to saying that the party, as bearer of the proletarian oil, can anoint with it whomever it wishes. In another context, however, Bettelheim appears to reject the view of the relation of party to masses on which the idea of the substitute proletariat depends. Bettelheim emphasizes in a number of places that as the essence of socialism is, quote, control of the direct producers over their conditions of existence, end quote, a party which wishes to play a role in socialist revolution can do so, quote, only if it refrains from imposing orders on the masses and remains the instrument of the work direct producers' initiatives. The masses' initiatives. The role of a proletarian party, therefore, is to help the masses to achieve themselves the tasks that correspond to their basic interests, by helping the masses to organize themselves, end quote. Bettelheim. Just as a side note, I think this kind of thinking is going to lead Bettelheim into the future into more libertarian positions. He basically, in the pieces that I've read from the latter volumes of his Class Struggles in the USSR, which I don't believe were published by Monthly Review, view the Bolshevik Revolution not as a working class revolution, but as a bourgeois revolution led by like a managerial class in waiting, and that fundamentally destroyed the grassroots dimensions of the Russian Revolution of 1917. So that's interesting. Coming from, as he does, from a Stalinist and then a Maoist background. To ensure, well, not that Maoism isn't a form of Stalinism, just to be clear. To ensure this, quote, as Mao Zedong has written, end quote, proletarian dictatorship must, quote, not apply within the ranks of the people, end quote, who must, quote, enjoy freedom of speech, assembly, association, procession, religious belief, and so on, end quote. Brave words, the very program of the Kronstadt rebels, shot down at Lenin's orders by troops under Trotsky's command in 1921 for demanding freely elected Soviets. In 1921, for demanding freely elected Soviets and an end to the Bolshevik monopoly of power, Mao's reaction when his call for 100 flowers to blossom was taken seriously, as is also well known, as is the treatment of the various oppositions to the Maoist line, which emerged in that super shake-up, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. It's important to note that the Trotskyist opposition in China was destroyed, um, virtually put in prison or deported, or if they could get away, um, in 1952, before the Hundred Flowers campaign and before the anti-rightist campaign that followed, which was, the Hundred Flowers campaign was later called by Mao an attempt to get the snakes to come out from under their rocks. So appealing for criticism of the party, and then when those criticisms actually came, repressing all the people who gave them. It's a very, very dirty trick. Anyway, how are we to explain Bettelheim's reconciliation of this position with his discovery of the death point of Russian socialism in the so-called de-Stalinization? De-Stalinization formalized at the 20th Congress of the Russian Party. This is, of course, the standard Maoist position. The riddle is answered if we put Bettelheim's words back into context, when it can be seen that Bettelheim's position is self-contradictory only if we take those words to mean what they say, departing from their special Leninist use. Let us retrace the argument. Sweezy begins it with a statement on the Russian invasion of Czechoslovakia, in which Sweezy claims that the latter country was indeed on the road back to capitalism, but that Russia is too. This is supposedly shown by the tendency, common to the Russian-controlled bloc as a whole, to substitute market structures for the centrally planned system set up by the Revolution of 1917 in Russia and imposed elsewhere by Stalin's army. Bettelheim replies by saying that the issue is not plan or market, but who has power, the bourgeois or the proletariat. This divorce of the quote economic from the social-political is of course nonsensical from a Marxist point of view, but for this Leninist, the structures by which the economy is organized are surface forms, compatible with different socio-political power structures during the quote period of transition. Of course, Bettelheim admits the historical task of the creation of communism ultimately involves the complete supplanting of the market by the planning principle. But in the course of this task, the state power may and must make use of a mixture of both techniques. The market, like the state, cannot be abolished. It must wither away during the period of transition. What is essential is the direction of the trend, away from or toward market relations, and the trend is decided by which class controls the state, which chooses the mix of techniques at any time. With this, Sweezy is eager to agree. To Bettelheim's next contribution, an elaboration of his concept of the large degree of independence of economic and political structures, Sweezy replies with the obvious question, how do we tell whether or not the proletariat is in power? It is in this context that he develops the idea of the quote substitute proletariat. It is Bettelheim's answer to this question that we must now alas examine carefully. The line of the argument may be traced as follows. 1. Quote, ... the true class nature of revolutionary state power, end quote, may be determined by, quote, the nature of the class interest served by it, end quote. Bettelheim. 2. This is to be established by seeing, quote, who is served by the state power, end quote, and by checking, quote, the concrete relations between the organs of state power and the laboring masses, end quote. Bettelheim. 3. The dictatorship of the proletariat, what we are after, depends on, quote, whether the producers are in power, end quote, and thus on, quote, the non-separation of the proletarian state apparatus from the masses, the proletarian state apparatus's subordination to the masses, end quote. Bettelheim. This means, e.g., no monopolization of political power and no repressive forces at the state's disposal. How will Bettelheim square this criterion with his designation of Lenin's Russia, with its Bolshevik dictatorship in Czechia, not to mention Stalin's Russia or Mao's China as, quote, socialist? The answer is soon to come. 4. To be socialist, the state apparatus must be, quote, subject to control by a party which is linked to the masses, and which helps the masses to struggle to gain control over the use of the means of production. Subject to control by a party which is linked to the masses and which helps the masses to struggle to gain control over the use of the means of production. End quote. Bettelheim. That is, the producers are, quote, in power if they are, quote, linked to a party which actually is in power. The masses control the means of production if this party is helping the masses gain such control. What is one to make of this stuff? One would think that either, quote, the masses have state or any other power, or they do not, that they either control the means of production or must still struggle to gain this control. But no, this is too easy. Let us return to Bettelheim, who will make it clear how the workers can be in power before they are in power. 5. Quote, historical experience shows that because of the weight of the dominant ideological relationships resulting from centuries of oppression, end quote, etc., quote, the political forms which are intended to enable the direct producers to organize themselves as a ruling class tend, if a systematic struggle is not waged against this tendency, spontaneously to transform themselves in the direction of ... a new separation between the masses and the state apparatus. A new separation between the masses and the state apparatus, end quote. Bettelheim. The political form Bettelheim means The political forms Bettelheim means are those created by the workers themselves in the course of struggle. Bettelheim cites as examples the Paris Commune of 1871 and the 1917 Soviets. Also, curiously enough, the Chinese PLA, which is organized neither by workers nor by themselves. We pass over, but will return to, the fact that the historical experience is not so one-sided. Here we're interested not in the facts but in the twists and turns of the Leninist position as laid out by Bettelheim. The workers, Bettelheim asserts, cannot keep power by themselves. They are, quote, partially separated, end quote, from the, quote, proletarian worldview, end quote, by bourgeois ideology, end quote. Bettelheim. Hence, 6, quote, the necessity to build a specifically proletarian ideological and political apparatus. A specifically proletarian ideological and political apparatus. A Marxist-Leninist party which embodies the proletarian ideology, end quote. The, quote, non-separation, end quote, of the masses from power can only be assured by ... their separation from state power by the width of the party. And the, quote, proletarian ideology, unstable among the proletarians themselves, is to be preserved in the person of the party, to be appropriated by the masses. This new Savior says to his flock, this is your body, this is your blood, and the flock need only be open to grace to receive it. Quote, the effective dominant role of the workers grows to the extent to which the proletarian ideology becomes their own ideology, end quote. Bettelheim. What makes an ideology proletarian? Not, on this view, that it is actually held by proletarians, who may yet have to appropriate it, but that it is developed, quote, on the basis of an analysis of the objective position of the proletariat, end quote. Bettelheim. Similarly with revolutions, and here is the solution to the problem of socialism in pre-capitalist areas, quote, the proletarian character of the revolution, in fact, depends more on the dominant role of the proletarian ideology and of the party which embodies this ideology than on the, quote, numerical strength of the proletariat, end quote. Bettelheim. Thus are all riddles answered. It all depends on the party. The party must submit itself to the masses, accept the masses' criticisms, and fulfilling the masses' wishes, but the decisions as to what these wishes are is the party's, made by means of the, quote, Marxist-Leninist analysis. Given the party, one can have a proletarian revolution with a mainly non-proletarian population, and while the key to preservation and extension of the revolution is the party's, quote, linkage with the masses, this too is up, not to the masses, but to the party. Quote, the only, quote, guarantee of progress along the road to socialism is the real capacity of the ruling party not to become separated from the masses, end quote. Bettelheim. That Russia, perhaps only after Stalin, took the low road and China the high one is due to the different behaviors of the two parties. Now, what seemed contradictory seems clear, until one remembers that both roads are leading to the White House door. But perhaps Bettelheim will point out that this is just a, quote, surface phenomenon, like the Stalin-Hitler pact. So we return to the, quote, theoretical level. What makes one party remain linked to the masses and another lose touch? To this, no answer is proffered. It apparently depends on the pure will of the party whether it, quote, serves the people, unquote, or the bourgeoisie. At this point, the theoretical edifice seems a bit shaky, and events of such historical magnitude decided by the good will of the, quote, upper echelons of the ruling party, end quote. Does our future really depend on the integrity of a few politicos? Have we, quote, the masses, so little role of our own to play, and they such freedom of action? It seems we must look at the whole matter again from another point of view. It is appropriate to begin with a, quote, rectification of names, end quote. Surely it can only help matters to call things what they are. Let us agree, therefore, to call, quote, proletarian consciousness, end quote, nothing but the consciousness of the masses of workers. It will thus be at most times a fairly heterogeneous thing. Let us call the ideas of Leninists, quote, Leninist ideas, however closely they may correspond to workers' interests. And let us speak of proletarian power only when the working class, and not a specific organized body, is directly is responsible for decision-making, no matter how stupid their decisions. This means, to be more concrete, that all representatives of the workers be revocable at all times, that whatever planning or coordinating centers there be possess no army, secret police, etc. Examples of proletarian power in this sense are to be found in the structures of the historical experience to which Bettelheim refers, the Commune, perhaps, the Russian Soviets of 1917. Actually, the factory committees are much more rightfully called organs of workers' power, to which we may add the Soviets of 1905, the German Workers' Councils of 1918, the Italian Factory Councils of 1920, the Spanish Workers and Peasants Federations of 1936 to 37, the Hungarian Councils of 1956. In some of these cases, something like Bettelheim's too abstract account, stressing their fragility, holds good. The German workers, for instance, with power in their hands, gave it over to the Socialist Party, which they believed would represent them in the state. Indeed, it seems accurate to call the belief that some special body of professional revolutionaries can make socialism for us a holdover of bourgeois ideology, though it is to be usefully explained not with phrases about, quote, centuries of oppression, but by tracing the history of, e.g., the German workers' movement. The case of the factory councils of 1917 in Russia is different. These supported the Bolsheviks, but did not simply hand over full power to them for good. It took Lenin's government till 1921 completely to eliminate the decision-making power of the organized workers, and it was finally accomplished in the case of Petrograd Kronstadt only by the use of armed force. One could argue, in contrast, that the peasants have never, despite the terror, been completely subdued till this day. Of course, it would be wrong to blame the, quote, bad will of the Bolsheviks for the failure of the Russian workers to hold social power in a revolution dominated by peasants eager for private property. But it is important to note that the factory committees collapsed not from a failure of spontaneity, but as a result of a historical situation within which the party acted as the executioner of workers' power. In Spain, the workers and peasants, also in an impossible historical situation, were crushed by the Communist Party and then by France. In Hungary, the workers' rebellion was destroyed by Russian tanks. Indeed, all these cases ended in failure, and they are crucial for an understanding of the possibility of communist revolution. The universality of the workplace committee or council, most recently experienced in the form of the action and strike committees in May 1968 in France, as the organizational form of working class revolt, both is an important confirmation of Marx's ideas on the subject and allows us to develop them far beyond the point open to Marx. Capitalism has created the possibility of socialism or communism by creating the working class, i.e., by consisting in an economic structure in which production is de facto social, even while control over that production remains in the private hands of the market economy. Living conditions become unbearable for the mass of the population who do the work. They are forced to rebel in a social way. Peasants may individually seize plots of land, but auto workers can only appropriate their factory collectively, and in combination with the seizure of steel and rubber factories, of bakeries and dairy farms by those who work in those places. It is this origin of the concept of communism and of communist practice alike in the world experienced by workers with whose character they must deal, which makes inane the concept of the substitute proletariat. The history of the long struggle of the party, in China and the USSR alike, to proletarianize the peasantry should be evidence enough. It is this also which makes it silly to contrast, quote, spontaneity with revolutionary organization. This puts the problem of the forms of revolt in a misleading way. Any attempt of workers to take any degree of social power demands, and has always produced, varying degrees of organization on local and broader levels. What is striking if we look at history is the minimal role played by the organizations of the left in the structuring of revolutionary struggle, and the extent to which they have served, in fact, as brakes on the workers' efforts. Just as the origin of proletarian revolt lies in the workers' experience of capitalism's incapacity to meet their desires, the organizational forms of revolt are developed out of the social structures of the system. The fact is that the workers are already organized in the factories, offices, schools, neighborhoods, and in the interconnection between all of these established by the capitalist production system. The problem of the organization of communist revolution is really that of the workers taking the existing network of social interdependency into their own hands and then reorganizing it to meet their needs. Conscious revolutionaries of different persuasions have their own problems of organization, different ones at different times, although these may be related to the organizational needs of the class as a whole. The important thing is to recognize the distinction between the class and the political groupings within the class. A revolutionary group may feel, as Leninists do, that their holding of power is crucial to the building of socialism. But it ought to be kept clear that the power of the party is not the power of the masses themselves, however representative of the masses the party may be at one time or another. This was recognized by the Russian Bolsheviks when they banned all political groupings except their own, for the party voted in could be voted out. If the workers are still willing to let some special group monopolize power and make decisions for them, this means only that socialism is not on the agenda. A group which wishes for the seizure of power by the class of which it is a part has a different problem. That of working in their class through propaganda and action to help ensure that no special group is allowed to give orders to it. This involves, obviously, struggle against Leninism in all Leninism's varieties. It is not an insignificant fact that Leninist groupings have played no revolutionary role outside of the underdeveloped world. Under capitalist conditions, they are doomed to be either liberal reform parties or conspiratorial sects, in either case significant only as expressive of the need, quite likely impossible of satisfaction, of capitalist domination to transcend its own private property structure and thus ensure, through centralized planning, its future existence. In the underdeveloped world, however, they have had and have a role to play, that of the bourgeoisie, which itself, for historical reasons, is unable to create the conditions for modern industrial development and class relations. The Russian and Chinese revolutions are more like the French Revolution of 1789, though this comparison cannot be taken too far, than they are like the one we in industrialized states may hope to participate in. Like the bourgeois revolution of the past, the new class which rose to power in the context of the overthrow of the old order by conflicting social forces describes its rule as the victory of the people, whose conflicting but, quote, non-antagonistic, end quote, Mao, class interests are reconciled in their collective domination by the state. This ideology, like that of bourgeois liberalism, only serves to hide, more or less well at different times, the class struggle which goes on throughout the process, by which peasants are transformed into workers, and workers give up their labor to be accumulated. Only from the viewpoint of this ideology can the economic, quote, forms be distinguished from social and political, quote, content, end quote. One second. Come on. Parenthesis. This is, of course, the whole point of Marx's Capital, end parenthesis. Sweezy's formulation nicely illustrates the situation, quote, all anti-capitalist revolutions that have hitherto taken place, have been faced with an urgent problem of how to run the economy, end quote. The mix between market and plan arises from the historical situation faced by the new government. Quote, prices, money, and even private markets remain, but these commodity-money relations are increasingly adapted and subjected to the plans developed to achieve the aims of the new men in power, end quote. In the Russian case, quote, the Bolshevik Party, which found itself lacking any real class base with responsibility, bracket, to whom, question mark, exclamation point, end bracket, for governing and leading a country with an overwhelming peasant and petty bourgeois majority, end quote. Sweezy. From this point of view, the market can appear not as an aspect of the system of social relationships which constitute private property capitalism, but as a, quote, technique of resource allocation, end quote, which might be emphasized at the expense of planning, thus leading to a return to the capitalist road, the quote capitalist road, the quote capitalist road. Like all ideology, this contains some truth, but presents it in a useless form. The quote market in the USSR today is, as noted above, not a real market, but a technique. Not, however, for resource allocation, which it isn't, strictly speaking, under capitalism either, but for working out the plan. I ignore here what markets, black and other, exist in Russia alongside the planned sector, as well as Russia's participation in the world market. And Russia, like China, was as much run by, quote, a ruling stratum, end quote. Parenthesis, Sweezy dislikes the word, quote, class in this context, for most un-Marxist reasons, but one can understand his discomfort, in parenthesis. When it was more centrally planned, as it does today, when the mix is supposed to have shifted to the market. Bettelheim observes that, quote, the notion of a, quote, direct and, quote, immediate abolition of market relations is utopian and dangerous as the, quote, immediate abolition of the state and is similar in nature, end quote, Bettelheim. The two are indeed related, market relations being the economic form of bourgeois rule whose place is taken in Russia, China, etc. by the controllers of the party state. The ideology of this state makes its own nature as obscure as the difference between the capitalist market and the state's use of the market form. Bettelheim puts his finger on the real issue when Bettelheim says that the heart of the matter is not planning, but who makes the plan. But that Bettelheim's enunciation of this truth only represents the party dictatorship's bow in the direction of, quote, the workers' control. But Bettelheim's enunciation of this truth only represents the party dictatorship's bow in the direction of, quote, workers' control, now so popular also in the West, is evident from Bettelheim's insistence that, quote, plan our market is therefore a false problem. If the right party makes the plan, it may also make use of the market. Socialism in any case depends on the primacy of the party. As Sweezy says, Sweezy and Bettelheim rarely agree on essential points, and the latter concurs that progress has been made in the discussion. Both of them, like everyone else, are for representative government, economic progress, and workers' control, as long as the class they speak for holds power, we can safely leave this triumph of Marxist-Leninist science to those who like that sort of thing. We have our own problems to worry about. The end. Paul Mattick, Jr.